And this is something I don't think we spend enough time in our public debates talking about. If I have to allow an extra 5 to 10 minutes of extra time because the bus may be late, that's 5 or 10 minutes out of my life that I had to spend because of unreliability. The best way, the easiest way to improve, to reduce my door-to-door time, which ultimately is important, is to get rid of that 5 or 10 minutes of uncertainty. If I could count on the bus being there within 1 or 2 minutes of me walking up to it, or on the time it's scheduled to arrive, that has a huge impact on my perception of the service being provided. So we've had a lot of discussion over the last few years about high speeds and the need for speed. This mode has a higher speed than another mode. Well, that has to do with taking you from station to station. That if we increase the speed considerably, it'll only shave, typically for a typical trip, only shave a couple of minutes perhaps off the trip. Where maybe you're spending 5 or 10 minutes waiting, another 5 or 10 minutes walking, and maybe you have a reliability fudge factor of another 5 or 10 minutes. So the speed, although it's important, is often not the most important part of the trip and not the most important determinant on getting people door to door in a reasonable period of time. We can also data. We can look at people's behavior in terms of how far are they really actually willing to walk. I don't think we spend time talking about that, but just to illustrate that, again, if we want to understand why people use transit, when they'll use transit, and hence how we should design a transit service that might actually attract people to use it, we need to take all of these things into consideration. And in planning, and in the modeling that supports planning, we actually try to do that. We actually, with some success, can do that. We can take all these different factors. So wait time's important, walk time's important, vehicle time's important, fare's important. And in particular, all these other things are important relative to what's the alternative. What's it costing me to take the car? What's the travel time of that car? What's the reliability of the car? And we can actually mathematically build models where we bring these things together. So we can talk about the utility of the trip or the generalized cost of the trip. What's the overall weighted perception of how good this trip is by this mode versus another mode? And in economics, we call it a utility. So we can talk about the utility or the benefit or perception of the transit mode as being some function of the various variables that go in. And we can actually empirically, by observing people's behavior versus the times, we can actually estimate how much they wait in vehicle time versus wait time and so on. So we can construct these models that allow us to try to predict what people will do in different situations. So this red line here is what we call a logit curve, which is expressing the probability of taking transit for a given trip as a function of how that utility of the transit trip, that weighted perception combination of all the variables affecting it, versus the utility of the alternatives available to you. And not surprisingly, when the utility of transit, what this is saying is when the utility of transit is very high relative to the alternatives, you have a high probability of taking transit. And when transit looks really, really bad relative to the other modes, nobody takes it. And in between, where the utilities are about the same, well, there's sort of a 50-50 probability that people will choose one or the other based on idiosyncratic factors and things that we can't measure, things other than times and costs that are difficult to measure. And these are, something like this is exactly what the City of Toronto uses, and Metrolinx uses, and MTO uses. We build these sorts of models right onto the computer, and we actually can use these models to try to predict what the usage will be in transit for every origin destination, for every trip in the system as a function of the service that's being provided. So this is a major tool that we do try to make use of. And I think, in addition to being, the tools we actually use, I think it's as a metaphor, as a story, it's actually very useful to sort of qualitatively explain the problems we're in. And again, as I say, if we have trips that fall down here, transit's non-competitive, people don't use it. Over here, transit's very competitive, a lot of people use it, and to a certain extent, and particularly from a policy point of view, maybe this is a very interesting area here where transit's competitive, and maybe with just a slight change in service levels, we might be able to get a lot more transit trips. And I'm going to come back to this curve several times to try to explain, illustrate the sorts of things I make.
Let me just interrupt one quick second. It sounds like there may be someone using a smartphone or something. There's a beeping. I could just ask you not to do that. Thank you.
Okay. And before I come back to that, the third point, another point I wanted to make is I mentioned the issue of land use and urban form. And again, we have to understand that there has to be a match between transit and transportation in general with the population and employment distributions, the density. Some things, particularly transit, only works where there's sufficient population and density and the travel pattern between things like population and employment that will generate enough traffic to make it cost-effective to provide the transit. And just, this always takes too long, but I think it's illustrative. Employment in particular, we spend a lot of time talking about population density, but the location of employment and the density of employment with respect to transit is actually at least as critical. And what this is showing is the employment distribution in Toronto. The data is all, the pattern is pretty much the same. We have a lot of people working downtown, a lot of employment up Yonge Street, but we also have a lot of employment out in the Pearson Airport area. Toronto downtown is still the biggest employment center in Toronto. It's the biggest employment center in Canada. The second biggest, however, is out in that Pearson Airport district. Some people have told me it's the second biggest employment center in Canada. I'm not sure if that's the case. So we know we have a strong downtown. We also know we have a lot of employment, all over the region. If we convert that to density, we get a very different map. This is exactly the same data converted to jobs per hectare or whatever the employment and the density unit is. And we see a very different thing. We have this Mount Everest spike down, which is the downtown. Extremely high employment density downtown. And then almost a uniform smear of employment spread throughout the rest of the amalgamated city of Toronto and sort of what we might call the inner GTA, southern York, Pickering, Whitby, out along through Mississauga and so forth. And in particular, the Pearson Airport zone disappears completely as a noteworthy thing because it's just that sort of that average low-level density. So why is that important from a transit point of view? If we look at the actual trip patterns that employment concentrations generate, here's downtown Toronto. Each stop represents, 50, 100 trips destined to downtown Toronto. This is not just for work, this is 24-hour total trips. And we see what we call a gravity-like pattern. There's a huge concentration nearby, but it spreads out in sort of a negative exponential way. But the key thing is the range, if you will, of this central place is the entire region. People will travel to downtown Toronto from all over because it's such a huge attractor. And they travel along, by and large, fairly major corridors, Lakeshore Corridor, and so on. So we can imagine that's a pattern in which we can build transit cost effectively to satisfy large markets. And in fact, we know we can do that. This is Mississauga Square 1, a sub-regional center, much smaller than Toronto, particularly back when this data was being put together. But it has the same sort of pattern, but the range is much smaller. It's largely restricted to Mississauga. And then here's the Pearson Airport trips. The range, as befitting a large center, is almost the same as downtown, but there's no pattern there. There's absolutely no structure to it. It's almost a uniform smear. And so the result is this, whoops, it's always dangerous if you push the wrong button. This we can serve by transit, and if we look at the actual transit mode shares, whether we're talking about all day or AM peak, and the color codings here on the bars are where they're coming from, different parts of the region. It doesn't matter what time of day, where you're coming from, where your trip origin is. If you're going downtown Toronto, Planning District 1, you have a huge probability of taking transit because there's good service. And then Mississauga Square 1, not so much. And by the time we get out to Pearson Airport, it's trace elements of transit because this pattern can be served by transit. This can't. And we have to understand that because if we just say, oh, we're going to start building transit and we're going to throw a bunch of transit lines out there, we can spend billions of dollars. And if we put the transit lines in the wrong place so they don't connect people to jobs and connect people to where they want to go, then it will be a waste of time. Coming back to my graph here, and this is maybe a bit messy to talk about, but again, here's still my same horizontal axis, looking at what, in the GTA, this was 2006 data, these are, for each origin destination pair, we can look at what its utility difference, transit versus the other, is. And then what we can do is we can plot, what I've plotted here is 4 zones that have this utility difference level, what the average wait times were, walk times, and and in-vehicle travel times at those different levels. And what we see is, notice that that blue line, which is wait time, average wait time, the red line, which is average walk time, this green line, green line here is in-vehicle time. They all go down in this direction, and what that means is as we go to the right, service is getting better, and we see that and that maps into a better utility score. What I've also plotted here is the density of those zones, all those different zones, in terms of population plus employment density. And what we see is that as density goes up, basically it's a chain reaction. As density goes up, we can provide better transits. As density goes up, as density goes up, we can provide cost-effectively better transit service, and the attractiveness of transit goes up. So this is another way just illustrating that land use and transit service and travel demand all go together and have to be considered. Okay, so how do we build a transit network to try to bring some of these things together? So the policy challenge, the design challenge is I think we really have two regimes in which we're trying to improve transit ridership. If we have zones such as this that are already in this area, it may be relatively simple or cost-effective to, small changes in improving transit utility relative to drive can give us big ridership gains because transit's already somewhat competitive. So this is an area in which it's perhaps relatively cost-effective or easy to significantly attract trips to transit. Out here, big changes, big improvements in transit are going to be needed to get anybody to use transit. And so this might be much more challenging to serve cost effectively. We may have to spend big bucks to get not a huge improvement. And unfortunately, unfortunately, this is much of our suburbs. This is where an awful lot of our trips are. A lot of our people are living and working and shopping in parts of the region where we're out here. And so one of our big policy challenges is how do we get these regions, in the first instance, over to here, and then maybe further improve them. And this is one of the challenges in terms of how can we cost effectively do that given the situation. So how can we improve service? Well, we said weight, walk, and vehicle times, reliability are all important. Well, we know there's lots of different ways that we can improve. We can improve wait time, obviously by improving frequency, schedule adherence, reliability, walk times, closer stop spacing, denser networks, in vehicle times, exclusive right-of-ways, transit signal prioritization, longer distance between stops. Notice that competes with this. The longer the distance between stops, on average, the greater walk times. So there's a trade-off between speeding up the vehicles and reducing walk times. Different decisions on different routes will make sense there. We'll come back to it in a minute. Reliability, again, this is very, very important. Again, exclusive right-of-way operations, transit signal prioritization, real-time management, and also real-time information systems are important. If I know the bus is late, that's helpful. So again, our apps on our smartphones, if I know the bus is running 10 minutes late, I can stay at my desk for another 8 minutes or something, get some work done, and then go out to the bus stop. So even just having information about lateness, in a sense, improves reliability. Very, very key, and I think this is probably something that's probably already come up today, is networks. We have to think about transit as a network, and in particular as a hierarchical network, starting with the good old local bus through to higher order things like BRT and LRT, up to subways and commuter rail. If we look at any successful system in the world, Munich's my favorite poster child, but New York, London, Paris, almost pick a city in Europe, they have a hierarchical transit service, because this is how you trade off, walking to the bus stop is that lowest level local bus. You have buses that are slow but frequent and have good coverage that connect to the higher speed LRT, that have longer stop spaces but higher speeds and also higher capacity, that connects to the subway, which again